Good evening. Again, my name is Dalila Scruggs, and I am the Mellon Curatorial Fellow for Diversity in the Arts here at the Williams College Museum of Art. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 17th year of the Plonsker Family Lecture Series in Contemporary Art. In particular, I want to give a shout out to all of my African American art history students who took my class last year. Thank you for coming. But I also welcome everybody else as well. Thank you. Before I tell you about our speaker, Kerry James Marshall, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the impetus for the lecture series. The series is the result of the foresight and generosity of two generations of the Plonsker family, Madeline Plonsker and Harvey Plonsker, Williams class of 1961, and Ted Plonsker, Williams class of 1986. And we here at the museum are delighted that Madeline and Harvey Plonsker are here with us tonight. The Plonsker Family Lecture Series in Contemporary Art was designed to further the understanding of contemporary art here on Williams College's campus. Over the past 17 years, the lecture series has enabled us to bring highly respected artists and art critics, such as Amalia Mesa Baines, Hal Foster, Kara Walker, Sarah Z, and Vic Muniz. Please join me in thanking the Plonsker family. This year, the Plonsker Family Lecture Series is honored to have Kerry James Marshall as tonight's speaker. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, and now living and working in Chicago, Illinois, Marshall creates work that is informed by the social and political context of his upbringing. As the artist has said, quote, "You can't be born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1955, grow up in South Central near the Black Panther headquarters, and not feel like you got some kind of social responsibility. You can't move to Watts in 1963 and not speak about it." And while the social valence of his work is clear, what is equally striking is the importance of aesthetic and technical execution. His work reflects deep engagement with painting as a practice and art history as a discipline. Marshall's artistic influences range from African American artists such as Charles White and Romare Bearden to European masters like Rembrandt and Matisse. He brings both a postmodernist eye and an old master's brush to his large-scale paintings of barbershops, housing projects, comic strips, and civil rights mementos. Kerry James Marshall's achievements are many, and so I'll just name a few here. Marshall received his BFA from the Otis Institute of Art in Los Angeles in 1978 and an honorary doctorate in 1999. In 2007, Marshall was awarded the prestigious John D. and Catherine T. Foundation Fellowship, more commonly known as the Genius Grant. Marshall's work has been included in many prestigious exhibitions, such as the 1997 Whitney Biennial, and Documenta 10 at Kassel, Germany, also in 1997, the 1999-2000 Carnegie International, and the 2003 Venice Biennial. Most recently, in 2010, Marshall had a solo exhibition at the Vancouver Gallery of Art in British Columbia, Canada. Marshall's work is now belonging to many prestigious collections throughout the world, including the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Art Institute of Chicago, the LA County Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In addition, Marshall has been the production designer for films such as Daughters of the Dust and Praise House, directed by Julie Dash, Sankofa by Haile Gerima, and The Hendrix Project, directed by Arthur Jaffa. For me, one of the most striking elements of Marshall's work is his treatment of blackness in his figural representations, in which he uses pure black pigment to render delicate and dignified portrayals of African Americans. These renderings bespeak an engagement with both Ad Reinhardt and Ralph Ellison. Ever insistent on the importance of technical virtuosity, Marshall is sensitive to the formal properties of black paint, manipulating cool and warm shades of black to achieve complex visual effects. Ever aware of the social implications of race, Marshall is eloquent about the perils of invisibility and hypervisibility that inhere in the experience of being black in America. As the artist himself once said, quote, "Extreme blackness plus grace equals power." And tonight we are fortunate to experience some of the artist's own power and grace. Please welcome me in joining Kerry James Marshall.
that was 10 times more eloquent than I'm going to be. So thank you for that introduction. I thought that was going to be brief. I thought it was going to be short. Perfunctory would have been okay. So left some room for me to riff on some things myself. Well, but you know what? I'm happy to be here. And I was so surprised to see so many familiar faces, some of whom I sort of expected to see, others I didn't. But it really is nice to be back in Williams. I had been here one time before, some years ago, when I was in a show at Mass MoCA, and Ed Epping, who teaches here at Williams, came over to pick me up and brought me over so I could see the Clark, because I had never been to the Clark. And took me around the campus a little bit. And Ed and I sort of go way back because I used to teach at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And Ed came to Chicago as the director of the School of Art and Design at UIC for a time. And we sort of hit it off early on and used to have a lot of really nice conversations with each other. And then he left and came back here. But it was a great meeting and a really nice guy, and I was pleased to see what the Williams community looked like. Now, I happen to show with Jack Shainman in New York, and everybody here I'm sure knows Professor Erwin Shainman, is Jack's father. And Jack's mother's here, his sister's here. It's like all these people. In the audience. So at any rate, but so what are we going to do here tonight? Because on the one hand, I always wonder why people waste their time coming out to hear what artists have to say about their work. Because it's not like I can tell you things and then you will all of a sudden see, and you will all of a sudden know, and you will all of a sudden believe that what I'm telling you is true. Because artists have there's as much myth-making in what artists do when they talk about themselves as there are facts that they tend to want to communicate. So what I'm going to do in part is talk in a way through some ideas that have a lot to do with the way I think about myself as an artist and the approach that I take to the work I do. Because the first things I'm going to read some stuff that I transcribed from a couple of essays first, and this will sort of set the stage and lay out for me what I think some of the challenges of making art now are, and say something about the stakes. It's like, what's at stake in continuing this enterprise that people like me are invested in, and people like a lot of you out there are hoping to be a part of at some point once you graduate from school. And so I think maybe I'll start. I want to read this before I say what that's about. Because those are not, I didn't do those. Those are not mine. So bear with me in this first part, because this is it's going to be familiar to some people, but maybe to some other people it's not going to be familiar, and it's going to be a little dense. But I think it perfectly captures what I think are the kind of critical issues relevant to what we're doing in the moment. And the first thing is these are both excerpts from essays that appeared in Art Forum magazine in 2005, in February 2005. And I don't know if you can go back and look and get the issue in which they invited a lot of critics to assess the new expansion and the renovation at MoMA, when it opened in 2005. And so in that issue of the magazine, there an article by Peter Plagins early on, and then there's a piece by Benjamin Buclos in there that I'm going to read something from too. So from both of these people, and I think they sort of set the stage and say some things that I think are really important to come to terms with. And so I'm going to start with the Peter Plagins piece, and I'll go a little ways in that, and then I'll go on to the Benjamin Buclos. So in the At the Crossroads section, Peter Plagins' piece was on this thing called The Post Artist. And he starts out, says, the art critics come in three types: goalies, cartographers, and evangelists. Goalies play defense, preventing undeserving art from being considered good. They defend against sloppy, indulgent, imitative, witless, and expedient art. Cartographers want to make the landscape of art more intelligible. They make judgments about which artists, which works, which roads between art and artists should be included in their putatively neutral maps. Evangelists are advocates proselytizing on behalf of artists they consider deserving. In the heyday of modern art, the evangelists fought for work that was in danger of being too advanced, too far out, too shocking to seed outside the garret. But today, bad evangelists abound. In the careers present, all criticism of any sort is at least partly advertising copy. Evangelism now has devolved to the equivalent of A&R guys pitching garage bands to major labels. He says there's also a timeless ratio of 10% good art to 90% crap. And then he goes on to quote the critic Donald Cuspit by saying, there is some truth to the theory that contemporary art has fallen into a rabbit hole of non-artness. It is no surprise that postmodern artists are caricatures of artists, disillusioned about art, but entertaining illusions about themselves, about what art can do for them, not what they can do for art. They mainly want to be made rich and famous, or at least newsworthy, if not exactly noteworthy. So this is the phase of what Donald Cuspit calls post-artist, the post-artist. Now, in sentiments that run parallel to what Peter Plagins and Donald Cuspit were saying, the critic Benjamin Buclos drops a series of neutron bombs in his article assessing MoMA's 2005 expansion and reinstallation of the permanent collection. In a particularly tough section, he writes, the magnetism radiating from Jasper Johns' paintings all the way to New Jersey is, first of all, on the order of an economic mirage. So contemporary paintings that fetch unimagined sums in auctions operating as contemporary orgies of the public destruction of private surplus value have surpassed the status of trophy and now border on that of the miracle. Under those circumstances, it has become more difficult to identify what our love of art actually loves the most. But if works in the contemporary galleries have not yet acquired this cult status of the multi-million-dollar art object, pity is the appropriate term for them. This is because they reflect the naive confidence of their makers in an art world apparatus and museum institution that they plan to inhabit as though times had not changed, and as though their privileged status as makers of modern art remains unconditionally guaranteed. It is also appropriate in response to the attempts by these artists to prolong the agony, to extend the lineage of painting and sculpture at least by an inch in endless epigonal maneuvers. In fact, the contemporary collection at MoMA makes it painfully clear that not only the social character of the artist seems to suffer from a failure of historical nerve, but the curators, collectors, and spectators alike appear equally desperate to hold on to a kind of object production whose time has come and gone long ago. Now, that's harsh. It's harsh, and yet it's a set of ideas and assumptions that cannot be dismissed out of hand and have to be taken into account. And they especially have to be taken into account by artists who as most of us do, I think, ultimately would like to be in a place like the Museum of Modern Art, like the Art Institute of Chicago, like the Metropolitan, like all of those great institutions that we come to know as representing the best that can be done in the field that we've dedicated ourselves to being a part of. Now, when I started out as an artist, wanting to be an artist, I had all that ambition too. And yet my ambition was tempered in some way by another set of circumstances that I had to come to terms with. And that was in large part the absence of a critical mass of or substantial numbers of African American artists in the museums that everybody took me to see the stuff that was supposed to be the best. And when you have to go to a museum, and this is when I was going to the museum, just like when you go to the museum, this is what art looked like to me when I went to the museum. This is what I expected it to be. This is what it almost always was. And so this is the default position that when anybody thinks about what art is, it almost always goes to the default position of Western European Renaissance painting and sculpture. This is what we know to be art. And it's what I knew to be art for the longest time, because every book I looked at, every museum I went to before I was 15 years old, this is what I went there to see. And so it was things like these. And now the complicated thing about works like these is that they are all magnificent. And whatever you think about the individual works or the individual artists, there's no getting around that these have been the works around which the idea of what art and art history has been codified. And so whether you like it or don't like it, you can't dismiss it in the same way that I think you can't dismiss the ideas that Benjamin Buchloh and Donald Cuthbert and Peter Plagens are articulating. You can't dismiss those things. You have to somehow find a way to either come to terms with them on their terms, or if you have a problem with it, you have to figure out some other kind of way of displacing that work with an idea that is equally as powerful as the one that they project. So anyway, we'll see a few more of these things. I mean, everybody knows these artists. So this is what art is supposed to look like. But in the current moment, some of this thing that Buchloh was talking about in terms of this spectacle, this kind of miraculous spectacle of this orgy of the destruction of surplus value, I mean, is represented by works like this by Damien Hirst. I mean, because everybody knows that it's like when you are operating in an environment in which a work of art enters the scene at the level that this one does, this thing enters the marketplace at $100 million, well, whatever you think of that, somebody's got to deal with it. You got to come to terms with what that represents. And the kind of attention that works like these attract is the thing that everybody else who is making artwork has to go up against. Because the thing that we're all trying to do is to gain attention for what we do, and it's sometimes at the expense of what other people do. And we have to also deal with this fact that in the Peter Plagens article, that 10% against the 90%, well, that's a reality too. Because the truth is that everybody can't stand at the top. And for us as artists, and this was a challenge that I assumed for myself when I started out, when I went to the museum and I didn't see works by other African American artists, that was a problem for me. And it was a problem that I felt like I needed to, and that I might have a chance at resolving. And it was not a problem resolving it by going down to the director's office at the museum and telling them, you better put up some stuff by somebody else. You know, it wasn't that kind of thing, but you had to go in and you had to match what was already there with a work that, on its own terms, claimed the right to be in there next to those things that were already in the museum. So that was the challenge that sort of presented itself to me when I started out as an artist. And now we sort of arrive at a moment where, you know, Damien Hirst, Jeff Koons, I mean, this stuff, not only is that sort of stratospheric when it comes to the exchange value that it has, but in terms of the level of perfection, in terms of the manufacture of work like this is stuff that's hard to match. I mean, if that thing is over 12 feet tall, and it's so shiny, it's not funny. And the thing is, it looks like it was never touched by a human hand. And that quality is an otherworldly kind of quality, and it generates a kind of an awesome experience that is, on some levels, a part of the essence of what we're trying to get to as art as well. This is where we are on the kind of high end. But we still have to deal with things that operate on the more prosaic, kind of popular end as well. And because people who are interested in making art, and in particular people who make paintings, are interested in images and the status of images, I mean, we look at a lot of different kinds of things. And I look at them like everybody else looks at them. And in popular art forms, these things play a huge role in how we understand what the visual landscape is supposed to be about, too. And so I bought this book, this Tasha, The Great American Pinup. And a lot of people would look at that book and not be bothered by it at all. But I look at, there's not one single black figure. Not one single black figure in the history of great American pinups. And so, whether you think it's a vulgar, sort of popular expression or not, it has an impact. When the objects and the images of desire represent only one dimension of a cultural body, and that there's no, where are the people who are not a part of that cultural body supposed to go for that same kind of desire that these images represent and point to? Where do they go? Are they completely shut out, or do they have to simply submit to the authority of the image that's being given? And so, same thing. So I said, no, not really. Not if I can help it. And so, and all of these things, these are the things that, so when I'm starting out, that had a profound impact on my development and my sensibility. And so we start out, you know, I started out like a lot of other people interested in art, with comic books. And back in the mid-'60s and early '70s, I mean, these were these were the books that I was looking at. The X-Men, you know, the Avengers, all of that stuff. The Amazing Spider-Man, the Mighty Thor, all of those characters who have been resurrected and now being recycled so that they are now the kind of characters and heroes for the current generation as well as for my generation, because they've all come back in more contemporary manifestations. But these are the images that I had to contend with, and as with the pinups images, for the longest time, the whole notion of what a superhero was codified and overdetermined by the model that was presented by Marvel and DC. until in this issue of the Fantastic Four, number 52, when they introduced the Black Panther. And literally, before that character appeared in that magazine, myself and none of the friends that I had ever considered the likelihood or the possibility that a black character could be a superhero. It never even crossed our mind because we simply accepted what was the status quo representation, and that's what a superhero was. But the moment that character appeared, all of a sudden the game was changed. And then you had to consider the absence of figures like that over the long period of comic book history before that moment. And so after that, everything had changed. And so that character appeared, and then you had Luke Cage, Power Man, and then Black Lightning. There was also a Black Goliath character. But those characters were characters that were introduced in the early 70s. And literally, they changed the landscape for a lot of my friends and myself. Now, the other thing that had a really profound impact on me was when I was in elementary school, I discovered this artist named Charles White. And more than just discovering that there was a person named Charles White, who painted images of black people like I had never seen them before, with the kind of power. I mean, that's graphic power. Those images had such presence. But when I was in 7th grade, I went to Carver Junior High in South Central LA, and the art teacher at Carver Junior High School gave me, there was a summer drawing scholarship to take a class at the Otis Art Institute. And literally it was for the upperclassmen, kind of thing, for 8th graders and 9th graders. But since there didn't seem to be anybody else who was as interested in art as I was at the time, he let me take it as a 7th grader. And I went to Otis and took that class. And there was a man who taught the class named George DeGroth. He had a book called Images of Dignity, The Drawings of Charles White. And he took the class down to the lecture hall and on the opaque projector, put that book on the opaque projector and showed us those images. And it changed my whole outlook on things. And then beyond that, Charles White had a studio on campus at Otis. And he said, you know what, Charles, there's a studio upstairs, and he said it was okay if I brought the class up to the studio to see it. Because prior to that, I thought Charles White was dead. And the reason I thought he was dead was because I had read about him in a history book. There was a history back in those days when, before African-American studies and stuff, they used to have this thing called Negro History Week. And I had to do a report for Negro History Week, and I found this book at the library called Great Negroes, Past and Present. And it had a biography of Charles White in it. Didn't have any pictures of his work, but it had an illustration that some other artist had done, kind of a portrait of him. But it talked about him and his life. So when I'm at Otis in this class with DeGroth, and he took us upstairs, it was like going into a magic mirror, going through a magic mirror. Because he wasn't in there, in the room when we went up. But in that room, there were works in progress on the easel in various stages of development and completion. And for me, as a young artist, really trying to come to terms with why artists like those first ones we were looking at, like Titian, like David, like Ang, like Rembrandt, like Leonardo da Vinci, how did those artists get to be the kind of artists they were? What was it they knew that made it possible for them to make the kind of work they were making? That's what I wanted to know that, because I thought if I knew that, if I knew what they knew, then I could make the kind of work that they were making. But when you're looking at things in a book, you know, the distance, first of all, it's like the distance between the real surface of the picture and what you see in a reproduction is tremendous. So you don't see anything any evidence of how the thing was put together or what the structure of it was. You can only get that by standing in front of the thing. But going into Charles White's studio and seeing work that was just beginning and then work down the line that was almost done and seeing things in various stages in between, that was a revelation. Because it showed, for the first time really, that art is not magic. It's something that people make, and it requires an incredible amount of work and an incredible amount of knowledge. And so to me, I started to adopt this approach where knowing is better than having talent. Because if you operate from what you know, then there's vast amounts of opportunity and options open to you. If you're only feeding off of some innate talent that you're supposed to have, based on this notion that people used to suggest that either you were born an artist or you were not. And if you were born an artist, then you were doing some kind of channeling, like a medium of some kind. The artist sort of going into a trance and then they wake up and they've done this thing. Well, for me, that didn't work. That wasn't going to work because I could tell from the kinds of drawings I was making at the time that I wasn't anywhere close to that. And that if I kept on going the way I was going, I wasn't going to get there. Just by doing it. I had to know something. Somebody had to tell me something. And so at any rate, we went back down to our classroom after seeing the work in the studio, and I took the book, and I was doing a copy of a drawing of Frederick Douglass from that book. And while I was in there, and Charles White walked into our classroom. And I decided at that moment that when I graduated from high school, I was going to school at Otis. Literally, and I was single-minded. Everything I did from that moment on was to get me to that place where I could be in school at Otis. But before then, there's a lot of time had to pass before then. And then even when I graduated from high school, because I didn't grow up in a family or in a household where anybody thought that it was possible to make a living doing artwork. And so the paradigm when I graduated from high school in 1973 was when you turn 18, you get the hell out of here and get a job. And my father said, if you can't get a job, join the Army. And so I graduated from high school. I went to work, like everybody was supposed to. And in 1974, the U.S. went into another one of its deep recessions. I don't know if some of you all here remember the 1974 recession. I was working at Kentile Floors at the time, and I got laid off. And I got laid off. I went down to the unemployment office and signed up, and then the next day I went down to LA City College and enrolled in school at LA City College. Because what I found out after I graduated from high school, because I was one of those people, I never went to talk to a counselor one time. And then 2 weeks before we were supposed to graduate, I went in to see the counselor because I was just going in to get my application to apply for enrollment at Otis. And so she called the school up, and they said, oh, no, you can't come into school at Otis out of high school. They don't take freshmen. You have to enroll as a junior, which means you have to do 2 years of general education someplace else, and then you take those credits and transfer into Otis as a junior. And so that meant that was 2 years delayed after the years that I was going to have to spend working on top of that. And so I was a little demoralized. But because I had met Charles White that first time when I was 15, or 14 or 15, and then I had started hanging out up at the school, he had told me I could just come up and do some drawing in his class anytime I wanted to. I didn't have to worry about paying. And so I was just sort of hanging out. So I wasn't too torn up about not being able to get into school, but I wanted to get there full time. So anyway, to make a long story short, I wanted to be like Charles White. And this is one of those places where you take some advice, and Leonardo da Vinci would give this advice in his notebooks for any young artist who wants to be a good artist and learn how to draw and to paint. He said, the first thing you do is to find yourself a good master and copy the work they do, which will train your hand, he says, to good form. And then over time, you'll acquire this sort of understanding of how form works, and then you can sort of break out on your own. And so in the beginning, I started out, I copied Charles White. I used to do work that was like this. This was my favorite Charles White style, is that really sort of highly stylized kind of figure. So I used to do work like that. I'll show a few more of those, but that's, you know, his work eventually evolved to a more refined kind of representation. But it was stuff like this that that revealed what was happening underneath the surface. That was the stuff that appealed to me the most, because I was trying to acquire this knowledge, the knowledge that I thought would make it possible for me to be the kind of artist that those artists were. But also interested in a lot of other things, and I'm not going to talk too much about this yet. But the one thing you can say from what I've shown in the beginning, all the way from the early Renaissance paintings through the Impressionist paintings, through the Manet, all through the Renoir, all of that stuff, what you can see from these things is that I consider myself completely a child of art history, or a product of art history. You know, I'm one of those people who believes that art begets art, that art comes from art, that it's not something that comes over you like a spell. It's not something that you just sort of arrive at. It's not something that you're born with to do. Artists make art because other artists made art that fascinated them and excited them, and they wanted to do that same thing too. That's why we do what we do. We want to be in the game with these artists. And a part of being in that game is trying to understand what it takes to extend the possibility of continuing to make painting in the face of a history of painting that is so deep and so dense and so magnificent that there's almost no space there for producing anything that's worthwhile, that can't be considered reactionary, totally derivative, and at worst, just the kind of a sentimental waste of time. So when we go through this, you can see I do a lot of different kinds of things. And all of the things that I do because I'm trying to understand something. But the other thing that I do when I make my work is I try to introduce into the existing paradigm, where I can, things that formerly codified aesthetic moments didn't do. And so for black folks, a lot of times, since so much of the territory had already been covered, the only thing we can really do successfully is try and introduce a different cultural subjectivity, a black subjectivity. And so taking our cues from art history and from African American history, as I do often, you know, that first guy, anybody know who that first guy was? I'm sure. And this man's name is Dangerfield Newby, which is a great name. But he was with John Brown at Harper's Ferry and was actually the first person killed at Harper's Ferry. And I made I made a painting that was a kind of tribute to Dangerfield Newby, because so he was killed at Harper's Ferry, and in his coat pocket they found a letter from his wife, who he had already acquired his freedom, but he had joined John Brown because he thought, first of all, he had tried to buy his wife's freedom from the man who owned her, and he refused at first, but then he agreed, but then he kept changing the price. Like every time he came up with the money, he would change the price. And so then he thought, well, the only way I'm going to be able to do this is to go with John. And so he ended up going with John Brown down to Harper's Ferry, and he thought maybe it's like if the revolution is successful, you know, we'll make it to the farm where my wife is, we'll be able to get her too. So anyway, so in his pocket there was a letter from him, and the opening lines of that letter was so poignant, and it struck me so close. The opening line was, "Oh dear Dangerfield, please come quickly. Please come soon." And then she goes on to talk about how she misses him and how she's anxious for him to come and, you know, for him to get her freedom. But of course, he never comes because he doesn't make it. So anyway, I did this work, and Delia had mentioned Ad Reinhardt, you know, and so this is the painting is called "Oh Dear Dangerfield," and it's a black-on-black painting. But the image that's in the painting is the structure is the shape of the armory at Harper's Ferry, and so it's a black on black. And so this is a way in which, because if you remember in your art history classes, you Ad Reinhardt was famous for declaring when he made his black paintings, he said, "I am painting the last paintings that can be painted." Because if painting is about opticality, it's about light, then in the black paintings, he says, "I'm turning the lights out on painting. I'm painting the last paintings that can be painted." And so, what the black paintings didn't do, and what minimalist paintings didn't do, was they didn't inscribe narrative. There's no narrativity in most black paintings and in most minimalist paintings. So I'm doing a black painting, but inscribing it with this, what the high modernists and complete formalists would call this sort of extra aesthetic sort of issues, where you're having to deal with imagery and you deal with narrative and you deal with content. So, but this is a kind of a strategy that I use in the work that I do. And this is an early painting. This is a painting from around 1980, 1979, 1980, 1981, somewhere around in that period. But also, in the same way, in terms of sculpture, I had developed this sculpture project for an exhibition I did at the MCA in Chicago. And it's really, if you remember that Congo sculpture you saw earlier, the things that people call the Nkisi figure, that people call them nail fetish figures. And so, if you think about a work like that, you have to figure, well, how do you make a contemporary work like that doesn't just mimic what the Nkisi figures do? And there's some artists who've made work like that, where they've done these little statues and they've put the nails and stuff like that in them. So you say, oh yes, 1 + 1 = 2. You know, this is like that. Da, da, da. So I'm saying, but that's not the approach, I think, to trying to figure out a way to inscribe the meaningfulness of the Nkisi figure on some kind of contemporary form. So what I think is you take the logic of the thing as opposed to the image of the thing, and you use the logic that determines how it came to be like that to make another thing that over time accumulates this material and this matter, and then it becomes over time this dense, the thing, because at the point at which we see the Nkisi figures, those things, they've already been used up, essentially. Did I do that? So they've been used up. And so what I did, I made this form, and this is a part of a group of sculptors called Africa Restored, in which you take the idea of the Nkisi, this thing that accumulates matter and material and stuff over time, and then at the point at which it fills itself up, then the thing is fulfilled. And so these are works that every time they get shown, there's more stuff, and there's more stuff, and there's more stuff, and there's more stuff. And not only is there more stuff, but in terms of the Nkisi figures and other cumulative kinds of sculptures, those things, like, it's just raw material. But in this case, every single thing that goes on these sculptures is specific. And they're specific in a lot of ways to African American history. And so everybody, you can see, it's like that, the picture on the lower right, Joanne Little. You know, a lot of people don't know who Joanne Little is. You got to go look it up because I'm not going to tell you. But I put a lot of things in there. So there's an image down on the lower left of Jimi Hendrix. You see there's an image of Frederick Douglass. There's Beethoven's daddy underneath that dark thing. You know, and some of it is that fun stuff because people have rumors that Beethoven was black. You know, so it's like you can have some fun with it, but you can also put some information in there that's relevant and that's serious too. And so that's a series of works. So you can see all kinds of images from all different phases of history as well. And then there's a group of paintings that always deal with, see, this idea of the pinup has been something that's important to me too. So this is it has that Trompe l'oeil piece of paper painted up there. It says, "Prettiest girl in the whole wide world." And I'm going to have to speed up because I think if I don't speed up, we're not going to have any time. So I'm going to show some stuff, and then I'll comment less. So anyway, these next three. So this is the prettiest girl in the whole wide world. There are reasons for that. Frankenstein. And the Bride of Frankenstein. And these are you could say they're life size. So they're 60 by 84 inches. So they're 7 foot, 5 by 7 foot, imposing. And I did a series of nudes, a couple of nude pictures where there was something a little coy about the way the pose was rendered. It's this notion of you looking, but you shouldn't be looking. Nude in the spotlight. I'm gonna go faster. Another pinup. You know, the sort of classic sort of pinup kind of tropes. You know, with the nude figures riding something. You know, that's a Black Power pic. The Black Panther flag, with the red, black, and green as a kind of crazy quilt. And then I do, as a part of my project, I do images of figures that have a presence in history, but of whom there's no representation, no pictorial representation in history. And so this is a drawing for this painting. This is a portrait of John Punch. And the Afro-Am students would know who John Punch is, I'm sure. And so I won't go into that either. But that there is no representation means something to me. That there ought to be is something that I'm trying to remedy by making these works. The same thing with this figure. And this is a painting, it's called, believed to be a portrait of David Walker, circa 1835, I think was the title. So believed to be a portrait of David Walker. And these are all people who have a historical presence. There's a significance around these people, but there's no representation of them in history. And I think by calling attention to their absence in history, by making a picture of them, maybe it causes people to wonder, you know, who, and maybe go and look. Now, David Walker was a free black man who wrote a pamphlet. He was an insurrectionist too, but wrote a pamphlet called David Walker's Appeal to the Colored People of America, and in particular, was the colored people of the world, and in particular of the United States. in which he has a critique of the Declaration of Independence and the whole kind of hypocritical notion of American freedom and independence as it was articulated by Jefferson and everybody, but not extended to the masses of black people who were being held enslaved by those people who were writing it. So, and then this is a portrait of Nat Turner with the head of his master. And then I did a series of paintings of painters. This one is called Scipio Moorhead, Portrait of Himself, circa 1776. And I'll just say briefly, so Scipio Moorhead was the first African-American artist, you can arguably. And we only know about him because when Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first African-American woman who had a book of poetry published, she mentions him in her poetry, in a poem, as the artist who did the image of her that's used as the frontispiece for her book. That's the only image we know of by Scipio Moorhead. It's the only mention of him anywhere, and there's no other anything available. And so I do these imaginary portraits like, well, yeah, Scipio Moorhead, this is what he would have been like. And he would have done a self-portrait as well. And then I did a series of portraits of artists, the artist and the palette, and what the palette represents in relationship to the image of the artist. And somebody may ask me about it. I'm not going to say more. So the same thing with this painting, this painting, this painting, which if you get down to New Haven, this is down at the Yale Art Gallery. It was in a show called The Embodied not too long ago, but it's not, the show's not up now, but that's in the Yale Art Gallery collection. And this, which is at the MCA in Chicago. But it's the idea, it's the painter, it's the image, it's who paints. And how the image and the idea of who paints or who makes art has, in some ways for a lot of us, is overdetermined by the things that we commonly see. I remember talking with John Bankston, who is another African-American artist once, and he was saying, you know what, he said, before I started painting pictures myself, my idea of the artist was a white guy, you know, with a beret, kind of thing. And even as late as like Mickalene Thomas said in an interview once, it's like, I didn't know black women took photographs until I saw Carrie Mae Weems' work. And it's like that you could get to the 90s, to the 80s and 90s and make a statement like that, there's something wrong with that to me. That should be unacceptable to anybody. And I find that unacceptable, and it determines in a lot of ways the kinds of things I do. Because for me, the greatest achievement on one level, apart from being in the collections, you know, that were mentioned, like the MCA and like the Art Institute of Chicago and like MoMA and all those places, but a part of what really matters a lot to me is the way in which Charles White mattered when I was younger. When a young black person goes to the museum on a school field trip and they see a work in there that reflects some interest and some sense of who they are and what they want to see, that means more than anything. And I remember Kehinde Wiley told me once, he said, I read in interviews, like the stuff that you were saying about Charles White when you talked about him in an interview, that's the same stuff me and my friends were saying about you when we were looking at your work at the LA County Art Museum. That matters more than anything. So, and in a way, sort of being there in the museum really does matter, in spite of the fact that if you take Benjamin Buclos's assertion, and it's not just him, but there's a whole a phalanx of post-structuralist critics and theorists now who all articulate this kind of end-game sort of, these end-game propositions about what it means to be making artworks now. And in some ways, if you take that as truth, as fact, it completely forecloses any possibility of you doing anything that's worthwhile in that domain. And for me, because there's still work to be done, there's still not a critical mass of the images in the museum that I think need to be there to do the kind of work that needs to be done. And only when that critical mass of images is present will it be, for me, reasonable to abandon figurative painting and go on to some other things. So, I mean, in the meantime, so I'm on a mission. I mean, and it's the mission to make sure, because this is, I wrote a catalog essay for a Chris O'Feely show that was at the Arts Club in Chicago. And as a part of the title of it is Just Because. And it starts out, it's a riff on a poem by the Last Poets, which was a group that a lot of people would say were precursors of what had become rap, but in the 70s. But the Last Poets, they had a piece called Just Because. And it was a Just Because You're Black. But the refrain was Just Because. And I used that as the kind of structure to do my piece. I do a lot of things because, but not just because I'm a black man in America, blah, blah, blah. And one of the things I did was to do the essay, I did reconnaissance. I went to the Art Institute of Chicago and I counted every single figurative representation of a white person and a black person that could be found in the museum at that time. It's like for those days. And literally, it's like I counted 300 and some odd images of white figures, and I think 2 images of black figures in there. And that ratio, that discrepancy, whatever you think of the work that's in there, that discrepancy is problematic for me and for other black folks like me. Because what the Art Institute finds, and what a lot of museums will find, and almost every museum I've been to has gone through these phases where they've done this audience development kind of thing. They get an audience development grant, and a part of the purpose of it is to see if they can bring more minorities into the museum, to help the demographics a little bit. But what you find is that when you put up shows that specifically have something to do with black folks show up at the museum. When you don't put up shows that have anything to do with black folks, they don't come in there. They just don't. And you have to say, why should they? Why should they? Why should anybody always be confronted with an overwhelming representation of somebody else who embodies what is supposed to be good and the best? Why would you submit yourself to that on a regular basis as a form of entertainment or as a form of enlightenment? Why would you do that? Nobody else does that. Why would we be expected to do that? And so the challenge ends up being, and this is, there's some internal dynamics that are relevant in this regard. But in this, there had always been this sort of conflict between abstraction and representation. With representation always getting the short end of the stick as opposed to the kind of modernist ideology is concerned. And then when the postmodernist ethos sort of arose again, figuration became a kind of useful thing to do again in the marketplace, and the museums start showing it again and stuff. But the truth is that if you make powerful images, the powerful images will end up in the museum. And if you're addressing whatever the issues are that are relevant to the discipline of making art at the time, they can also find their way into the museum. And so that's a part of the challenge. So anyway, that's a bad slide, but this is the precursor to a group of works called vignettes. And it's like it's this group of vignette paintings that I did, where you're always trying to position where I'm always trying to position the representation of black figures in genres and domains where you rarely find them. And the thing is, like, and in most of these genres, even like the Rococo, which is what I was using as a kind of framework, as a point of departure for these, in that vignette style, that vignette as a form, which is an 18th century sort of Rococo form. But there'll be black figures in some of those paintings, but they're always peripheral. They're always at the margins. They're always doing something incidental. They're never really central to the representation. And those are charming pictures. We kind of like those pictures, even though a lot of critics and historians don't. And I met Yves Allenbois. I was in France. I was at Giverny once, and he was there too. And so we were sitting there talking, and I was saying, I can't wait to get to Paris because I want to go and see those Bouchers and those Fragonards. And he said, why would anybody be interested in that? Which is another one of those ways in which you have an authority who forecloses any possibility of doing anything that's worthwhile with something that they have declared to be obsolete. Now, when you're operating and this is the thing, for black folks in America, we're operating in an arena and in a domain in which we don't have any of the kind of authority to match that. Because we're not in a position where we define the terms under which any of these ideas are being engaged. We don't do that. So on some level, we sort of reject or dismiss those things at our peril. Because so the philosophy that I had developed is that you cannot have people out there in the world who know more about what you're doing than you do. Because if you do, then your well-being depends on the generosity of people who may not know you, who may not like you, and who certainly don't have your best interest at heart. And that you cannot live in the world or operate in the world where that kind of dynamic exists. Because if it does, then you are at the mercy completely of any of these authorities who will declare at any given moment, as Yves Allenbois did, nobody should be interested in that. There's nothing in there for you, and there's nothing in there for anybody else. So that's the kind of thing. That's what the Benjamin Buclot represents. And you can see the implications of that when you take, the whole October Gang did the latest edition of the Art Since 1900. They did, with Rosalind Krauss, Hal Foster, Benjamin Buclot, Yves Allenbois, all of them, they did that. It's like, where are black folks in that? Really? Well, they arrive at the moment when identity politics becomes a part of the discussion, in the late 90s, maybe early 80s, but late 90s. And then there's one section on the Harlem Renaissance in that book that neither one of the principal editors of that book made a contribution to. And so we're operating in a world where if Charles White was one of my heroes as an artist, if Romare Bearden was one of my heroes as an artist, if Jacob Lawrence maybe was one of my heroes, if all these people were my heroes, that none of my heroes show up in the discourse about what's relevant in the art that's being made from 1900 to the present. So that leaves you with a dilemma. And it's a dilemma that has to be addressed. It can't be dismissed. So anyway, let me forge ahead. I'll show a bunch of those. That's not a great slide either. But this is the suite. I was telling somebody, when the Art Institute of Chicago opened their new wing, they had purchased this suite. It's a suite of 5 paintings that were a part of that vignette series. You see what they do? So it's a 360 rotation. This is the key picture. And if you remember the Fragonard painting, the swing, it's like, well, what was the purpose of that, the swing? Well, it's like, oh yeah, okay. In the painting, the priest is pushing the woman in the swing, the lover is down in the bushes, so he can look under her dress when he pushes her out over the place where he's hiding. And so this whole thing is so that you could look right up in the middle of that woman's crotch when he turns her around towards your face. So that's the whole point of the point of the whole suite of 5. Had to do 5 paintings to get you there. So, but this is how you sort of take the something like a Fragonard painting, and instead of making a picture, instead of doing in some ways what Yinka Shonibari did, to inscribe the work in another form, with his mannequins and his costumes and stuff. Instead of doing that, to take the logic of the work and do something that's different, to do something that doesn't already exist, but that refers to that work in an indirect manner as opposed to a direct reference to. That's the way I choose to work. I don't see an interesting photograph and think it'll make a good painting and then do it. But it's all those things that you see in the kind of hallmark, like greeting cards, the kind of romantic kind of relationship, the kind of postery kind of things. And then there's also this other thing where, see, I'm obsessed with, on one level, I'm obsessed with doing things that people tell you you're not supposed to do. And doing it like you mean it. And so, and that whole romantic kind of imagery thing, that whole kitsch kind of thing, where, I collect paint-by-number paintings and thrift store paintings and stuff like that. And then there are all of these, there's this genre, there's a genre of art called black art, in which these kinds of themes predominate, But the problem, see, one of my problems with the work of a lot of African-American artists historically, and the way we exist inside the museum as an institution, is that more times than not, the work that's in there exists on such a modest scale as to be easily overlooked if you didn't go there looking for it. And so in some ways, the work becomes inconsequential because the artists, in some ways, are afraid to assert themselves in the same way that a lot of other artists did. It's like when Barnett Newman did Who's Afraid of Red, White, and Red, Yellow, and Blue. How big is that thing? He wasn't waiting to find out whether people were going to accept it or not, or whether they might think it was a little bit too much or something. He went for broke. And my thing is that you got to go for broke, because if you're going to get in the game, you get in the game because you want to play to win, and you're playing for keeps. And so when I made, this is like one of those seascape paintings. That's 6 by 9 feet. So it's like, okay, I make a picture like that, but I'm going to make it like I mean it. And the same thing with that one. I make it like you mean it. And then back to the black paintings. But it's that same thing. It's like, this is also 6 by 9, but that's, so it's a black painting. It does all the things that the Ed Reinhardt paintings do. Except it does it with imagery as opposed to with just as just the kind of formal kind of thing. That's it over there in the corner. But I'm also, I think maybe in some ways I was fortunate to go to school when I did. Even though I never went to graduate school, I didn't go to graduate school after I got my BFA at Otis, because I was so pissed off when I left there. And I'll tell you what I was pissed about. Because when I wanted to go to school at Otis as a teenager, and I wanted to know all that stuff that was the reason why Da Vinci and Leonardo and all those people were in the history books and stuff, I wanted to know what they knew. And somebody had promised me that I would be able to learn that when I went to art school. But when I got to art school in 1977, all that was over. That was finished. And so this was at the moment conceptual artists really had taken over in the academy. And at Otis at the time, they had literally successfully, they were on a jihad. really, to get rid of everybody who was doing anything that looked like traditional artwork. You know, the painting, the sculpture, like, so they successfully sort of arrived at so in the department was called intermedia at the time. You could do performance, you could do conceptual art, you could do installation, you could do all that stuff in intermedia back then. And they had literally successfully beaten down like all the people who wanted to paint and to draw and, you know, to teach that stuff. And so you go in there and if you had a conversation with a professor one time during the semester, you were doing good. And so that's why I decided I wasn't going to go to graduate school because I could see how it looked like it depended too much on cliques, on whether the professors in that department liked you and whether you hung out and went to the parties and all that stuff. And so I left school and I said, look, I'm not wasting my time. Why would I waste another 2 years and waste the money going to graduate school? I'm going to prove that you can do all the things that a person with an MFA is supposed to be able to do without having to get one. Now, I'm writing letters of recommendations for people who graduated with their MFAs from Otis who are trying to get jobs in the field. But the thing is, like, and I say it should be based on the work you do, not on who you know or who you're hanging out with or what all of that stuff. It shouldn't be based on any of that, but it's how you engage the work and whether the work proposes something that seems worthwhile at a given time or moment. So anyway, but those are all mine. That sculpture is mine. The prints in the back are part of this Rhythm Master thing. But I'll say briefly one thing about that sculpture. Because it's like, well, here's an idea. If you remember during the Harlem Renaissance era, there's a theorist and historian named Alain Locke, who formulated this idea of the new Negro at the time. And this is like when black folks were supposed to start to come into their own and make a claim of ownership for something that they would develop. And the process of doing that, he said at the time, was to look to African art as a source for black folks to start kind of developing some kind of aesthetic sensibility. And which was met with resistance on a lot of parts and with an incomplete understanding on some other parts. So when people started doing things that would supposedly had African themes, they thought it's like if you made a still life and you put an African sculpture in it, then that was sort of a kind of Africanist kind of thing. That's not it at all. And a part of the resistance to this whole idea was based on the assumption that there was too much distance between African art and Africans in America, that there wasn't any connection with that work. And so, but my instance, well, there isn't any more connection between Africans in America and European art either. So in the same way that you can adopt and learn some sort of aesthetic principles and formal principles from European art, and then try to make that evolve to something that has a kind of singularity that you can call your own. Well, you could do the same thing there too, because they're both intellectual exercises. And so I'm beginning this project where it's like, can you create an evolutionary chain that takes classical, traditional kind of African sculpture, like a Yoruba sculpture, something like that, and submit it to some evolutionary changes and transformations and make it become something else from that point by doing one thing and then doing another thing and doing another thing and doing another thing and doing another thing until it transforms itself into something else. But that it all has to start from logic that happens within that thing. So for me, I'd say the first thing you have to do is to do something that the African sculptor didn't do. And in most cases, because a lot of those sculptures are fairly archaic in their presence, the first thing you can do is let it step forward and turn in space. That's the first thing. And then after that, then you start doing a lot of different things until the thing completely transforms into something else. So this is the beginning of a project that means to try and see what comes out of the process of doing those kinds of things. I'm going fast now. But I'm going to stop here. And here's the thing. Now, when I went to the LA County Art Museum as a elementary school kid on that field trip they take you on, and I said, this is what I want to do. I want to do work. I want to be in this museum among all of those other artists whose work I'm coming to the museum to admire. And there was some great work in there, some things that I still do like. They have a great set of Veronese paintings at the LA County Art Museum that are still among my favorite works they have. But I say, this is what I want to do. I want to be in that museum with those artists. I don't want to just come down looking at that stuff. I want to be in there too. And this is the first museum purchase that was ever made of a work of mine. And it was made by the LA County Art Museum back in 1983. The first museum. And so, in a lot of ways, all of my ambitions had been fulfilled in that picture when it was acquired by the LA County Art Museum. I had done what I set out to do, and I did it on the terms that I had established for myself. And so I felt really successful. And then literally from after I made that work, everything had changed for me. And I felt like I understood perfectly how to move through a whole series of choices and productions in what I made to get and to achieve all of the things that I set out to achieve for myself. Because the goal really was ultimately to get work that had that foreground of these black figures at a scale that was uncommon into museums around the country, and then from there we could see about getting works in museums around the world. So you walk into the museum, you can't miss this because it's over 10 feet tall and it's 10 by 11 feet wide. You can't miss it, and that means something. That means something. It's not afraid to be there, and it's not afraid to be there representing what it represents and projecting what it projects. That matters. A series of we're sort of going backwards in a way and thing, but I had done this whole series of Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Cub Scouts, Brownies. That's a big print, a big woodcut. It's 48 feet long. And then a series of paintings based on the pastoral. These were based on the housing projects in Chicago. They were pastoral paintings based on housing projects in Chicago that had garden as a part of their name. And so it's the promise and the reality. And then this was the one, when my family moved to California from Birmingham, we moved to the Nickerson Garden Projects in Watts. And the place we lived was just on the other side of that field. And so the title of that painting is Watts 1963. And the title, based just because of what it portends, because in 1965, when the Watts riots broke out, then everything was different after that. But these are all big, and these for me were my version of history painting. It's like in every way, it's the scale and what I think of as the complexity and everything. This is how you could do history painting at that time. Wentworth Gardens. Most of the only one that's outside of Chicago was the Nickerson Gardens one. But all of these take place. These are set. This is Washington Park, right near where I live in Bronzeville in Chicago. And then this was the installation of the show at the MCA in Chicago. I'm going fast. Paintings called Mementos. Big, really big paintings, 13 feet. The end of that series of works. And then the comic stuff. You return to things that were really important to you. And so I developed this comics project that has three components, but the Rhythm Master is the central narrative in the whole piece. And so this is just some images from that. These are all of the characters, and it's like African sculpture with African power figures that are reanimated by rhythm patterns on the drum, you know, to be superheroes. There's more of those. And another project, I have a Monuments for a New America project that I'm working on too. So. But this is the format. So, anyway. And then, so that rhythm master thing, I did a project at the Wexner that was based on Bunraku puppetry, which fascinated me. So three years ago, I went to Japan. I met some puppet makers and some puppet troops. And then I did a project at the Wexner where I had high school kids. We taught them how to do the Bunraku style puppetry. And we did a show based on a script I wrote based on the Rhythm Master project. And these are some of the puppets I made for that as part of the set. Another one of the puppets, those puppets. And then some photographs. Because we're out of time. All right, so you see, I mean, from all of that stuff, I think if there's anything that is important to say about what it means to continue making paintings and sculpture and drawings and things like that in the face of a kind of critical environment that doesn't really have much space for that kind of work, is that you have to have a reason, you have to have something you want to do, and you have to know what it is, and then you have to understand where it sort of fits in to the overall discipline of image making and object making at this moment, in this time. And so you can actually you can point the work you do to areas where there's an absence and try to resolve that absence. But if you're just going on the assumption that if you think your stuff is good and somebody's going to recognize it, then I think you're asking for trouble. To me, almost everything you do nowadays has to be thought through and done in a fairly strategic manner. Because on some level, it's not an option, for me at least, it's not an option to have somebody else deciding whether I can play or whether I can't play. I have to know before I start out that I have a better than 50% chance of getting exactly what I want before I get in the game. And if my assessment of what I'm doing at a given time seems to point to the fact that it won't make it, then I need to be reassessing what I'm doing and modifying my position so that it starts to satisfy my need. But it also has to satisfy a need for the discipline that I'm engaged in too. So that's the thing. It's this notion, everything I do as an artist is completely self-conscious. And it's goal-driven and goal-motivated. Now, the other thing that never really gets talked about so much is that, you know, once you cross a certain threshold in the art world, my God, it gets incredibly expensive to keep doing this. I mean, it's not cheap. And the thing is, and you have to be able to do it. It's not enough to have one good year or two good. You got to be able to do this. If you think it's like going into the arts is a better alternative than working at the post office for 30 years and getting a certificate and a gold watch, you got to be able to do this. You got to be able to sustain whatever you're doing as an artist for 30, 35, 40 years too. if you want to have a meaningful and a kind of long and a worthwhile career as an artist. I mean, you got to be able to do this for 30 years, and you got to be able, you got to always, it's always got to be fresh for you and for the people who are going to assess it. Because it's like you have to have some sort of criteria of your own for measuring whether you can achieve what you want to achieve. But it's always going to be against an external set of criteria, because that's where a lot of the judgments are going to be made too. And so you can't discount, because you don't like what people say, what people who are outside your circle of friends. The worst people to talk to about what you do are your friends and your family. And part of the reason for that is that your friends and your family are invested in you. They want to see you succeed. And so they will say things to you that will keep your spirits up and, you know, help you keep moving forward. But that's not where you want to be. I mean, you really want to get in the mix where people are going to hit you upside the head as hard as they could, and are always telling you got no business being there. And if you can hold your own in a place where people are telling you you don't have any business being there, then you're going to probably do all right. So with that, I think I'm going to stop, because we're past our time. And thank you all for listening.